Welcome to Think Out, the monthly debate series of the Institute of Science and Technology for Humanity at Nanyang Technological University in Singapore. At the Institute of Science and Technology for Humanity, we address societal challenges through interdisciplinary team research. We combine the latest in science and engineering with deep domain knowledge from the social sciences, humanities, businesses, and the arts. In each Think Out, we bring together leading researchers and sometimes industry experts from very different disciplinary backgrounds to discuss and debate an important question the world is facing. In a Think Out, we aim to dive deep into a complex issue, have fun, and engage you, the audience, to this open discussion between leading thinkers. Today, we address the question on how advancements in genomics are leading to new kinds of inequalities. My name is Vanessa Evers, and together with my colleague, Hallam Stevens, we will moderate this debate. So over to you, Hallam.
Thank you very much, Vanessa. I am very pleased to welcome our two esteemed panelists this afternoon, Dr. Joanne Yao and Dr. Ian McGonigal, and I'll introduce them in just one moment. The way we're going to run this, we kind of advertise this as a debate, but really in some ways this is more of a discussion. We do like the panelists not only to engage with one another, but also with both of us and also with you in the audience. So we do encourage you to ask questions, put comments in the chat and Q&A, and to follow up if you wish to as well. And you can begin to do that right when they begin speaking. So the Q&A will be open. The way we're going to do this is we ask each of our guests to make a brief introduction, stating their kind of positions and talking about their research on this topic a little bit before we actually open it up for a broader discussion. We also, as some of you who tune in to this video often will know, we have a poll question to begin, and we do this at the end as well. And perhaps we can put that up now. Today, the question is about whether you think that genomics increases or decreases inequality in healthcare. That's really the substance of our topic today. So while you're contributing to that, let me introduce our panelists today. First, we have Dr. Joanne Yao, who is an associate professor at NTU's Lee Kong Chiang School of Medicine and a senior consultant in the Division of Medical Oncology at the National Cancer Center in Singapore. She heads the NCCS Cancer Genetics Service with an academic interest in hereditary cancer syndromes and translational clinical cancer genomics. Her clinical focus and research revolves around understanding cancer predispositions by studying cancers that cluster in families, young adults, and families with multiple and rare cancer presentations. Dr. Yao has a master's in public health from the Bloomberg School of Public Health at Johns Hopkins University, which she obtained in 2015, and has a career focus on cancer epidemiology and health economics. And this really puts her as one of a handful of global experts on these topics in clinical genetics and health services research. She's won multiple awards, including the NMRC Clinician Scientist Award in 2021 and the Equity Initiative Southeast Asian Health Equity Fellow 2021. Let me also introduce at this point Ian McGonigal. Ian is an assistant professor in the sociology division at NTU. He's a scholar of anthropology, science, technology, and society, or SCS. He's broadly interested in the relationships between science, technology, and identity. His current research focuses on relationships between human genome projects and ethnic identity in Asia. He's recently published a book titled Genomic Citizenship: the Molecularization of Identity in the Contemporary Middle East. This open access book was made possible by generous funding from Arcadia, a charitable fund of the Lisbeth Rousing and Peter Baldwin Foundation. He's also a filmmaker, and his ethnographic film, Redemption, Wine and Prophecy in the Land of Israel, has won several awards, including the Award of Eminence as the Best Documentary Feature Film at the Swedish International Film Festival just this year. So with those introductions, let me hand over first to Dr. Yao to give her introduction. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Hallam, and thank you very much to Think Out for the invitation. It's really nice to be able to spend Friday afternoons discussing science and society issues with the audience. I'm just going to share some slides and very quickly explain why I think genomics has been so important for medicine. So as Hallam introduced, the area of work I work in is in cancer, but this is equally true across different chronic diseases, the role that genomics is starting to play. So just for those in the audience who are not aware, cancer is the leading cause of death in Singapore and globally. To make that even more real, because that's a very abstract statement to say that cancer is the leading cause of death, what it means for Singapore at least is that every day 40 people are diagnosed with cancer and 15 die from cancer every single day. And 1 in 4 of us will develop cancer in our lifetime. And this will increase by 2030 to 1 in 3. And this is because of 2 incoming tsunamis, that of aging and that of just cancer on its own. And that's one of the reasons why it's really important that we take an approach of trying to understand why people fall sick, what keeps people healthy. And that's where the genomics come in a very big way. We want to try and understand what is the underlying genetic background that allows someone to be healthy versus predisposed to certain chronic illnesses. And not only the genetics, but also the health, the exposures, and also the social determinants of disease as well. And all of those components together is really the only thing we have, the only weapon we sort of have against the incoming tsunamis in terms of healthcare. So one of the reasons why I started working in this area was I was trained as a medical oncologist, where I don't know whether you're aware, but chemo treatments are extremely expensive. And there's no way as a health system we can continue to afford such expensive therapeutics. And really what we want to try and do is go from a very reactive type of care to a much more proactive care where we understand who's at risk and try and intervene before people get sick. This is good on the individual level for the individual, but it's also very good at a health system level, because then we actually save costs in terms of expenditure on incurable diseases and the rest of it. So from that perspective, one would think that genomics is extremely useful in terms of leveling up inequalities, because if it comes to treatment, it's well documented that a lot of access of chemo drugs is not available to individuals of sort of lower socioeconomic status, or access even in countries, in our neighboring countries to the right treatment is very, very limited. So I'm going to stop there and pass over to perhaps Hallam or Ian.
Thanks very much, Joanne. That's a great introduction. Okay, let me hand over straight away to Ian to give his brief introduction too.
Okay, so thank you for the invitation. As Hallam introduced, I'm an anthropologist, which means I study culture and technology, and I'm less in a position to make prognostications about the future, but I can talk a little bit about contemporary societies. And just to situate genomics in the context of Singapore, you know, the Human Genome Project was sequenced in the early 2000s, and since then, genomic technologies have rapidly spread around the world. And anthropologists and people who are interested in studying science and technology socially have asked questions about the consequences on genetic privacy, the ethics of data sharing, and lots of scholarship has made clear that different nations have different expectations about trust, transparency, and public reason in relation to new technologies and how exactly they should be governed. So from the outset, my position is that different societies and perhaps different segments of societies will react to new technologies in different ways. And so we can expect inequality of uptake of technologies regardless of availability, just embedded differences in terms of knowledge and in terms of attitude. And that's what I'm going to talk about. So as a given, because of things like culture, different educational backgrounds, religion, socioeconomic status, or other factors, different people will have different views on technologies. And in order to investigate this in Singapore, I was awarded a grant from NIST with Hee Lim Kim in the Asian School of the Environment and with the support of Genome Asia 100K to look at genomics and public attitudes in Singapore. So colleagues in our team used public surveys in Singapore, and we assessed genetic literacy and perceptions of genetic testing. And so we conducted a public survey of 560 adults and long-term residents in Singapore. And I'm going to share a slide now that will show a little bit about genetic literacy in the population and perceptions of genetic testing. So here we have a slide, which is a brief summary from some of the data. This is from the public survey of Singaporeans and long-term residents. And what you can see on the x-axis is the different socioeconomic groups by household income. And in blue, what we have here is a measure of genetic literacy. So this is based on a survey of 17 fairly straightforward questions about knowledge of genetics, questions along the lines of, I receive half of my genetic material from both of my parents, true or false? And the questions get more challenging. And so what we have in Singapore is an average of around 47, 48% genetic literacy, which might sound low, but it's comparable to similar states of similar size like Qatar, where similar work was done. But what you can see is there's a significantly lower level of genetic literacy in the lowest income group. So there's intrinsically some inequality of knowledge of genetics in the population. If we look at the perceptions of genetic testing, and this relates to a series of questions along the lines of, I support the use of genetic testing in healthcare, or I support the use of genetic tests in various diagnostic procedures, you see that the difference between the lowest income group and the rest of the income groups is quite stark. So what I would argue is that it's important not just to imagine and anticipate even the consequences of new technologies and their access, but also how they play out in society because of existing intrinsic differences of inequality. So essentially my argument would be is less that technologies will lead to inevitable inequalities, but rather we ought to first also recognize that there are existing inequalities, and at least in the case of the data that we've generated, that this lower level of literacy and the lower level of perception of genetic tests may actually be a barrier to getting lower income groups to be supportive or even engage in things like genome projects or genetic testing. So that's where I will finish my presentation.
Great, thanks. So I guess we can all unmute and get the banter going between us. I'd like to invite the audience to put in any comments they have, questions they have, suggestions. If we come with answers that you have follow-up questions, please also put them in. Opinions are also welcome. So feel free to use the Q&A to really engage with us. We'll keep an eye on the Q&A to make sure that we see all your comments and questions. The poll, it might be good to revisit the poll. So the poll question was whether genomics would increase or decrease inequality in healthcare. And 66% of people thought it would increase inequality, and 34% thought it would decrease inequality. We've just heard from Joanne and Ian about the possible need and desire really for genomic data to make sure that we can actually tackle things like cancer much more efficiently and effectively in the future. And Ian, how, because people think differently about genomics or know different facts about genomics, it really impacts the way they are open to or positive towards the idea of genomics. We had quite a few pre-event questions that people signed in that related to the threats from genomic research, where people were saying, you know, I'm not even quite sure what are the threats for genomic research. It just doesn't feel right. It just feels a little bit scary. It feels a little bit like, oh my God, there's going to be this data about who I am at a genetic level, and you know, what should I be worried about? And actually a little bit less, what should I be happy about that this is available? So I'm not sure if one of you or both of you would want to comment on that, give a little bit of a context for those concerns and happiness feelings around genomics.
So I might start. I think a couple of things. So firstly, when I first got home from the States to sort of implement genomics in the clinic, in the cancer clinic and all of that, one of the things that I noticed was not only just patients, but even the clinicians around me were telling me things like, nobody wants this information. This isn't information people actually need. And there was a lot of skepticism about the role or the acceptability of genomics information. But it's, you know, I've shown in our data and our research as well that actually it's a matter of just literacy. You can't ask you can't ask people if they want something before you've done the education to ensure that they understand what it is, what it can possibly provide in terms of intervention, in terms of care. So I think we've done, a very thorough. I have to condense 10 years of work into like maybe two minutes, but to say we've done a huge series of educating clinicians, patients, the public on what's the role of genomics, how do you use it, and that kind of stuff. And what we do see is that actually the patients who year after year, they are much, the literacy rises, it does rise, and that they once they understand the role, then they actually engage with the material and with the topic. But Ian's absolutely right in that we have to be very intentional about how we implement it, because there are all these inherent inequities that exist. And if we were to just be very unintentional about it, that's when we actually worsen the inequalities. But if we are more intentional about it, I think this is something that's addressable. So I'm going to stop there and maybe let Ian go in. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Joanne. Yeah, I agree. And I think maybe one of the other issues that you raise is the desire for the genetic privacy, that people generally want to feel like they have control of who has access to their genetic data. And actually, in our surveys, it is interesting that while I was able to just show you on the slide that there's a difference in genetic literacy and general disposition towards genetic testing, we didn't find any difference in the desire for genetic privacy across education groups or across income groups. So, regardless of how much people know about genetics, or even how well disposed they are about genetics, there's quite a embedded sense of people wanting to have control over their privacy. And I think that that's something that we'll have to deal with in terms of policy making, and also recognize that those desires for privacy are quite legitimate, because as we know, if you have a rare genetic anomaly in your family and it's rendered public, this can cause embarrassment, offense, stigma, and so people legitimately will want to have some control over their genetic data, and that's important. But of course, that desire may also stand in tension with the possibility of establishing large genomic databases that can be used to develop, better diagnostics for rare diseases. So there is a tension there between the desire for genetic privacy and then the need for people to actually, surrender their genomic data for the collective good. So I think that's a societal tension that's also at stake.
So I might counter Ian a little bit there. I don't think those two things are necessarily separate, because I think we've benefited, our team as well as others in genomics medicine and genomics research have benefited from the donation of data, in the hundreds and thousands and the millions to global databases that are pretty much at this point in time de-identified, clearly meaning that we are only interested in the variant, what the genetic alteration is, with whether or not someone has a particular phenotype, which is a disease manifestation. And that kind of level of information has, as Ian's mentioned, opened up lots of progress in rare disease work, in first finding solutions and treatments. So I think it's possible to actually be able to protect privacy as well as advance public good. So I think again it comes back to being aware and being intentional about it as we progress, right, collectively. But I would counter that the two of them are not always in tension. They can be successfully managed.
Yeah, that's good to hear. And I think the way to make that work more effectively, perhaps, is with more public education and outreach, so people understand. If they understand what the privacy protections in place are and how they work, and then they can be more confident, and it can only be good for everybody.
And I think there's an issue there too of trust, right? We have to trust the institutions that are collecting this data, and maybe this actually sort of leads to one of the questions here, which is an interesting one, which just popped up, which is about commercial genetic testing. And so services like Circle DNA and 23andMe. And yeah, I mean, that sort of not only raises a different kind of sort of set of issues about privacy, but perhaps also has other effects that on sort of equality, on potentially raising inequality as well. So I was wondering if either of you might like to comment on that since it's been raised.
I'm going to let Ian go first.
Yeah, sure. Look, that's not my area of expertise. I haven't been researching recreational genetic testing, but I think it's interesting because I did ancestry.com, for example, and it told me a little bit about my ancestry. It basically said I was mostly from Ireland, which is absolutely correct. But several years later, when I logged back in, there was a small percentage from Scotland. So what does that mean? It means that the reference databases are changing all the time. And so the more people contribute, the higher resolution, the higher resolution of, at least for ancestry for sure. But it also raises the question as to what other information they may be able to glean from your data down the road, especially if you've signed off on it. And then also, as much as the clinical databases might be very well protected with de-identification measures, if you've sent your identity to these companies, raises the question as to how secure their databases are, whether they could be hacked, and whether that information could be used detrimentally down the line. So I think there are legitimate concerns about securing your data. And I would just add on to that, as an anthropologist, I'm always attentive to the relationships between people. So we often think that we're the sovereign custodian of our genetic information, but we're disclosing a lot of information about our kin, our children, our parents, our siblings as well, when we disclose our genetic sequence. So that's also, something to be cognizant of.
Yeah, actually, in that last point you're making, I read this huge article about people that went on 23andMe to find out more about their past. They might be adopted or they might be interested in their genetic background. But at the same time, 23andMe is also used sometimes for forensics, to be able to find potential family members of people who have done criminal acts. I'm kind of struggling for words here.
The Golden State Killer is the key example here, I think.
Exactly. So this is kind of a very unexpected side effect. I mean, sure, I'd like to know my genetic data, but if at the same time, I condemn my brother to the electric chair in the US or something like that, that's a huge consequence that I didn't have in mind when I went in there to use that technology.
I would just add a little bit to the direct to consumer, at least in the Singapore context, in terms of clinical use, actually the Ministry of Health actually does have a guidance that it should not be used for clinical care, and that it's really just recreational. I think there are many reasons for that, because one, it's hard to govern, the kind of curation that happens in commercial labs and the rest of it. So I think it's when it comes to direct to consumer testing and use, it's very much buyers beware, right? So it's very much you as the consumer, just as with any consumer goods, you do your assessment and you determine in terms of what value that test is to you and what you give up as a result of that. So I mean, that's all I'm going to say about DTC, except that I would caution very much. So there's one particular DTC company. If you read the informed consent fine print, it says like crazy, like lots of lines of, you should not be using this for your healthcare needs, right? Like probably two pages of it. And then right at the top of it, when you get the results, it says, please go consult your doctor based on these results. And that's just kind of a very, I would say, it's not helping, because you are telling people you don't use this, but at the same time, go bring this to your neighborhood family doctor to discuss it, right? I mean, what's that about, right? Because you either should be using it or not be using it. So I think these are the areas where it's going to confuse the public. And as Ian mentioned, and as Helen mentioned, if the literacy is not quite there, if the trust is not quite there, this actually makes things, puts us backwards a couple of years, probably sometimes, if it's misused. So I'm a bit concerned about that aspect of it.
So I want to pick up on one other thing that I think is related to another question, but I think it's important here to bring it in. This related to Ian's point that he mentioned reference populations. So we've talked about inequality, because this is one of the things we're talking about, genomics and inequality, and this is one of the things that I think is a critical issue here. So one thing is access, and we've talked about access a little bit already, and maybe we can have some more discussion about that. But the other thing is representation, right? And Ian's example, Scottish and Irish people in the database, right? But let's take an example. How many Australian Aborigines are in the database, right? And if I am an Australian Aborigine, for example, what chance do I have if I send my DNA in? What are they going to find out about me? And so this is obviously in the case of ancestry. This is maybe just recreation, but this has real consequences, I think, when it comes to. So I think you see the point. So maybe either of you would like to comment a little bit more on this question as well.
We've got a direct study that looked at this in Singapore, and I'll share that, and then I'll let Ian jump in as well. So, for example, when you just maybe to explain genetics a little bit more to the audience. So when you actually have a genetic test done, your blood or your saliva or your buccal swabs are taken, and DNA is extracted, it's sequenced, and then it's compared against a reference genome. And whatever is the reference genome is therefore considered the normal, right? And the reference genome is made out of thousands of individuals. But if you're not represented on the reference genome, then when you have a genetic alteration, it comes out as a variant, right? But it could really just be normal in your population, but it comes out as a variant. So we asked this question in our local context. So I will tell you that in the clinic that I run, which is at the National Cancer Center in Singapore, every patient that comes in for a cancer predisposition genetic testing done, half of them will get a variant of unknown significance result. A variant of unknown significance means that there's not enough data either way to sort of say whether that alteration is going to lead to disease or not lead to disease. And this is because there's not enough reference genomes from Asia in this. This is the reason why the variant of unknown significance rate is so high. If you were Caucasian, that's going to be a lot less. So this comes to the question of the inequities exist actually even in terms of how we interpret the data. So the fact that there are not enough Malays, Indians, and Chinese in the genome makes a big difference. And that's one of the reasons why both the Genome 100,000 Asia as well as the Singapore 100,000 Genome Project will help to plug some of these holes. But right now in the clinic, it's definitely having an impact. Yeah.
Interesting. I think that's quite related to what Ross Chung is saying from Hong Kong. He says, access to genomics technology and Medicare metadata itself might be unequal. And you basically, if the technology doesn't have enough examples from people in your own reference community, then it's unequal. You're being disadvantaged in that way. So he mentions that access to genomic data may disadvantage people, which is true. But you're kind of saying, Joanne, there isn't even enough data yet. Once there is data, the access could be unequal. But for now, you really need to get more data so that you can offer kind of an equal investigation.
I'll just jump in on the point of indigenous peoples because Hallam raised it. The challenge with generating reference genomes for indigenous populations is that many indigenous populations had suffered from colonization and discrimination in the past, and so the question of trust comes up as to whether they are willing to trust medical researchers who maybe in the past had harmed them. And it's difficult not only to build a trust, but also where there aren't formal institutions of representation, where there isn't a prime minister of X indigenous group or a president or king or whatnot. It's often difficult to gain informed consent for the group, because it's not only with indigenous populations that the individual is understood as the sovereign agent, but the group identity can be quite important. So this raises challenges for recruitment. And unsurprisingly, most of the genome projects, although they're more commercial ones now, they have been led by states. So it has been states that have been, the institutions that have been able to generate the credibility and the trust to recruit populations. So I think that the question of inclusion of minority groups that may have suffered in the past is, a tricky one and one of trust. But perhaps the biggest challenge is not just making sure they're represented, but who represents them and who can speak for the group. This is an ongoing difficulty.
But I guess this is a kind of feedback effect, right? This is a kind of result of past inequality that could lead to, new inequalities or inequalities in a new form. Because let's say, I think if I'm understanding you right, Joanne, what you're kind of saying here is that because there's enough data, say, about Caucasians, we may be able to make better predictions about their health in the future. Whereas if, let's say, an ethnic Malay person had the same testing done, we may not be able to make those predictions about their cancer prognosis. Is that more or less the way this works?
The way it works is depending on your ethnicity, population, and all the rest, you might have novel, unique variants that's being seen for the very first time. So that's when it happens. So when you have a genetic alteration, a variant that's seen for the first time, in a gene that might predispose someone to a disease, it could be that it's related to disease, or it could be that it's completely benign. If you have enough individuals with that same change, you would know over time if they do get the disease or if they stay well. And the case of all the minorities and like ethnic Malays, Indians, Chinese even, there's definitely a lack of data, but that's being addressed. I think there are a lot of population cohort studies now actively being done in Asia and Asia Pacific. That's quite a bit of investment by states, as Ian mentioned. Whether or not it reaches every single population that it needs to reach, that's the other question that we don't know. I wanted to answer maybe one thing about access. So I think it's I've given many of these talks about genomics, right? And everyone focuses on access of genomics, but it's really not access of genomics that's important, because even after you access genomics and you find that someone's high risk versus low risk, you need to be able to have access to the healthcare measures beyond that knowledge, just be it screening, be it intervention. So I'll give you an example. I'm just going to, I hope I don't get in trouble for this, but I was invited to, for example, in Indonesia, to give some guidance, because they too wanted to do a state-sponsored genomics study, right? A 100,000 Indonesian kind of genomic study. And one of the challenges was, how do they use that in terms of improving care? But for example, if the idea is that you find yourself to be high risk of breast cancer, and if knowing that, then the intervention is more mammograms or more MRIs of breast, if that structure isn't there to address that need, then you don't need the genomics, pretty much, because you don't have the necessary downstream infrastructure to address it. So I think there's somebody that raised a question about the proactive healthcare system. So I think really a proactive healthcare system is not just the genomics, it's really the genomics plus everything else that you need to do once you find someone being at increased risk or reduced risk, right? So that's kind of another thing to talk about. Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah, I mean, maybe just to push on this, there's a couple of questions from Shirley Sun here, who is our colleague and Ian's colleague at NTU, about I think the question is driving at what's different perhaps about Singapore, and this is also an interesting question. And the question is about why this is maybe talked about in explicitly kind of racial terms, sort of Chinese, Malay, Indian in Singapore. And I guess, yeah, I mean, is that I guess the question is really about why is this talked about in these terms in Singapore, and is there anything special about Singapore with regards to these kinds of problems of genetic representation, I guess. Not sure if either of you would like to say something about that.
Yeah, you can say a few words about that, because we our team published an article about Genome Asia 100K, who I've been collaborating with as well, and I think. And also we've written about the Helios program as well, which is a Singapore-based genome project and health study. And the Helios project looked at the major ethnic groups in Singapore, and the way that the government governs in Singapore is with the CMIO model, the Chinese, Malay, Indian, and other model. And it seems to me from our investigations and interviews that CMIO model has been unproblematically, adopted for the purposes of genomics. Now, in terms of making a overly clear-cut distinction between ethnic groups, because you have Indians from different parts of India, very genetically diverse, and you have Chinese from different parts of China that arguably, might warrant their own, reference genome for a sub-ethnic group, and you could go down that road. But I think the short answer is that, at least it seems at this stage, that mode of governmentality has just been taken up by genomics. I don't know, Joanne.
Yeah, it probably warrants a more complex and long answer, but the short answer is I wear two hats, right? One hat is as a researcher, and I'm on the Helios project as well, one of the PIs there. And I'm also a clinician, someone who needs to apply that knowledge. So I'll say that the way we look at it is a little bit different. Using the CMIO model for discovery work or for science, right, is helpful, because you're trying to look at what's homogeneously within certain classifications as much as you can, based on how you recruit and all of that. But then when it comes to applying it, that's a very different story. And that's what we're finding in the Singapore context. We are a very open, diverse community. And so actually the CMIO, self-reported CMIO classifications actually don't work. And the data is going to show that. And I think the data will then lead us towards moving away from CMIO. So although I would agree that right now recruitment is, and these are the kind of data that's being collected, but once the genomics data comes out, and I'll share it very briefly that we're wonderfully admixed and impossible to just use race alone in the clinic, is what I would say would be my conclusion from looking at some preliminary aspects of the data, which is that we're very, very admixed. So you can't just say you only need to think about these conditions because you report as being Malay, because the Singapore context is we're wonderfully admixed. This might be different in different populations globally, obviously, some being much more homogeneous. But you can imagine from a scientific perspective, trying to understand disease associations, it's a lot easier if you deal with like a uniform, like, a very close population as opposed to a very broad one. So I think that's one of the reasons why research projects are structured that way. But I don't necessarily think that that's how we would be wanting to use information in the future. Yeah.
So a big difference between Iceland and Singapore.
Exactly.
In that respect. Joanne, you mentioned in the context of proactive healthcare that, if you don't have all the solutions downstream, it's kind of no use to know the genomics if you can't do anything with it. In the same way, how does that work for responsibility? I mean, once I know, do I then have the responsibility or the obligation to disclose that? It kind of brings other questions on board, maybe, I don't know, towards my insurance or something, or towards, responsibilities towards my family.
I might ask the anthropologist that.
I think that's a really challenging question. And I think in short, I'd say the norm might change, right? Before we had risk markers, you might not have to disclose high blood pressure, right, to an insurance company. The norm could change if we all have our genome sequenced and we get valuable, reliable data about, markers or groups of markers that can say something meaningful about our future disease risk. The norm could change down the line. But I think it's important to remember that these are also democratic decisions. Just because we have that data available doesn't mean we necessarily have to use it for that purpose, and that if we have stronger values of equality and treating everybody equal regardless of their genetic inheritance, then that could also be implemented legally to ensure that genomics doesn't drive inequality of healthcare, or that people with a certain genetic marker have to pay a higher insurance premium. So I think my argument would be that genomics could be used to drive inequality, but these are questions of governance rather than necessary technological consequences.
So I think one of the ways to think about it is there are ways to maybe come up with term insurance plans where it's the same way where we buy insurance for travel, right? It's not grouped according to whether, it's just grouped according to where you're going and the rest of it. So I think there's some work around this that can be done where we can be more intentional, such that the responsibility is shared across the population rather than with the individual that has a certain particular risk predisposition. But that requires us to have much better data than we currently do have. And I think that's where it will go eventually, because I think that's what we would all be working, at least I'll be working towards, and I'm sure Ian would be as well. But at the moment, we're just not quite there yet. So we're probably going to have a period where things are going to get a little bit worse maybe before it gets better, pretty much as well. So that's what I think about that aspect of it. About the responsibility to share, we go through a post-test counseling session with every patient that comes through, and we tell them about what the implications are for the family members. And that's what we talk about in post-test counseling, and that's the cascade testing part of it. And as a health system, that's the one that actually makes a big difference. If people proactively learn about their risk and do some care. So you could argue that on a societal basis, there's real impetus that we should try and encourage people to actually know, right? Because that saves costs at the health system level. But of course, as Ian mentioned, this is a democratic decision. It's a shared decision making. We go through the pros and cons, and every individual makes that choice for themselves. And we have a lot of parents coming to us and telling us that let's say they test positive, but their child is under the age of 18 or 21, depending on which country you're in. And the parents will come and say, I want you to test that as well in my kid. I want to know, right? But we've always said no, because the child themselves, as they become an adult, would have to have that decision making, go through the decision making for him or herself, whether or not they would want to go for that. The only exception is if it's something that affects them as in childhood. That's when we would offer the testing in a child. So I think there are these caveats, as long as we're very intentional and do it in the way that it should be, we can probably avoid some of this inequities, possibly, hopefully.
I think that leads, I mean, I think it's linked to a question, an interesting question that's come up from an anonymous attendee here. And this says, again, it's about this question of distribution of resources. And the question is, will genomics encourage a different kind of preferential distribution and application of medical resources? And yeah, I mean, I guess I can imagine that if we, you know, that a country like Indonesia, for example, or any country really has, you know, a certain limited number of mammograms, for example. And can you imagine, or would it even be desirable for genetic testing to play a role in how to allocate, you know, for example, that kind of scarce resource?
Yeah, so the hope is if genomics can help some of the countries leapfrog, you know, some of these challenges that they have, right? So I think if genomics get cheap enough, and if interventions like, you know, if we have very cheap ways of like, for example, familial hypercholesterolemia, just to move away from cancer a little bit, is where people get very high cholesterol levels and they're predisposed to very early heart attacks and strokes. That's actually not an expensive test to understand and the risk and all. So for example, in that kind of context, this could be probably be done more quickly in the population versus some of the cancer interventions that I was talking a little bit about. And then the other thing about redistribution of resources, you're starting to see that already in the Singapore context. Those of you who are living in Singapore will see that we're going away from hospital care to community care to, instead of illness, to how do we maintain people being healthy. So that's already happening, but it's very hard for this shift to work. And I'm very glad that it's coming from top down, at least in the Singapore context, because in every country in the world, to try and tell a taxpayer, I always tell my team, if you had $1 to spend and this $1 is to be spent on treatment for someone who's actively sick now, versus $1 to be spent on preventing a possible illness 20 years later, where would you put that $1, right? And I guess it's just, I'm not saying I have the answer to it. I'm just saying this underlies the complexity of the discussion, and yeah. So it's not a straightforward answer to that. Yeah.
That's interesting. Yeah, it's so complex, everything around it. From a similar complexity, but a very different direction, Syed Alkaf is saying, you know, what is this mismatch between how you self-identify as your kind of genetic background or your heritage, and then, you know, getting the genetic information? There can be a strong disconnect. So he's mentioned he calls himself Arab, but his generations of his family have been in Southeast Asia for a long time. And actually, he would probably fall into the Malay category. So there's all this self-identification, but there's also this kind of hard identification through genomics. And that can really mismatch in someone's life. Yeah, I'm not sure if I'm asking an answer from you guys, but some reflection on how these identification or misidentifications.
Yeah, I can jump in. I can jump in on that because, you know, we mentioned that in Singapore, the model is the CMIO model, but there was also a Peranakan genome project because they have a sufficiently strong, you know, unique ethnic identity. So identity is important because when a group of people actively get together and petition to, you know, have themselves studied as a group. This can lead to, you know, that identity getting, you know, further credibility with the establishment of a genome project. So it's certainly the case that identity is important. But I think what Joanne already alluded to is that in the future, you know, if we started with national genome projects and then we went to CMIO, and then we might break down into, you know, even sub-reference groups. You know, I think the ambition is that eventually, if everyone has their genome sequenced, you can check within the family line and identify novel variants that way. And so there's a sort of a move from the national to the ethnic, possibly towards the personal. So it seems that, you know, ethnic identity matters now, but I wonder if it will matter in 10 or 20 years.
Maybe I'll just pick up on that idea of identity, right? I mean, one of the things that's been suggested about this kind of testing for risk factors is that people will increasingly identify themselves and perhaps also be identified according to risk factors, right? So you may say, you know, rather than saying, you know, I am Scottish or something like that, right? You may say, I am a person who has a risk factor for Huntington's disease, right? And that this becomes a kind of defining part of your...
Makes you attractive on the dating circuit.
Yeah, well, right. I mean, you know, in some cases that is actually important, right? In terms of like with kind of sex-linked diseases, for example, right? But yeah, and I mean, this on the extreme end, that may lead to discrimination by insurance companies, for example, in premiums. But I wonder whether, you know, you see, first of all, whether you see that as being a likely kind of effect, and second of all, you know, what other effects might this kind of, you know, increasing identification with our risks or with our genomes might have.
Like updating your Tinder profile. Like
I might give you, I'll give you two insights, right? So the one insight is that it's very inevitable sometimes, right? For someone who's being told that they have a genetic predisposition to whichever condition, to immediately assume that persona that I am, you know, predisposed. So that's kind of almost the natural kind of thing to happen. But what then happens during the counseling process, as well as post work with the group, is we work very hard to ensure that they understand that that doesn't therefore define them, that therefore doesn't, you know, and one of those, the thing that needs to happen is we almost need to normalize it, right? So the more we treat genomics with gloves, sometimes I feel the worse we make it for these guys, right? Because, and one of the things that has happened by having a physical clinic, right? So we have a physical clinic, which I started in 2014, and we started it as a once a week clinic, and it's now 12 sessions in a week, basically at the National Cancer Center. So it went from very small to now a broad service. And every time an individual comes to that clinic, they see 10 other people in the waiting room, waiting to be seen for example, for genetic testing, right? And the more they see that, they actually, you know, right now, a few of them are like, this is really common, isn't it? And then you're like, yeah, it's really common. And they're like, you know, oh yeah, that, you know, we were chatting and that person has the same thing as I do. And then that kind of conversations normalizes it, that it's not something that we can destigmatize some of it, but I will say that again, it takes a lot of engineering almost to kind of try and reduce the natural tendency to then feel stigmatized by the outcome. I don't know, Ian, if you have something to add to that.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely right. And I actually just finished reviewing a book called Mobilizing Mutations by Daniel Navon, which is exactly about this point, how different groups mobilize around shared mutations, and even mutations that don't necessarily present clinically, that they can become the grounds for the formation of new groups. And this builds on this idea of dynamic nominalism developed by Ian Hacking, the idea that groups come together, you know, and they advocate for more research on the group, and that the group becomes a more real entity as time goes on. So genomics is deeply embedded in, you know, individual identities. And as you said, it can be the identity of the group can be an unknown genetic marker, which I think is fascinating. But I actually wanted to jump in and maybe actually I can turn the table and ask Hallam a question, because I know Hallam has also written a book about genomics in China. And, you know, as an anthropologist, I'm always, you know, interested in the comparative and how it is that, you know, genomics might lead to inequality in one context, but not in another. So I'm actually very curious to hear if you have anything to say about genomics in China and how, you know, the Chinese Communist Party might be driving genomics for the nation, or whether they have the idea of the singular nation, or they're, you know, going along the lines of ethnic groups, and how identities and nationalism are coming together in China.
Great question to end with a couple of minutes left.
Yeah, that's a big question. Yes, I mean, I think that, yeah, I won't try to answer it definitively here, but I think that in China, absolutely, the Communist Party is attempting to mobilize genetics for the state. I mean, as you may know, China recognizes exactly 55 ethnic minorities, no more and no less. And so there is a, rather than CMIO, the 4 categories in China, there are kind of 50, 55, right, that are defined. And so there is a kind of, yeah, certainly a kind of construction of nation and a construction of personhood that exists around the genome, and also around the idea that genomics, as Joanne mentioned before, can help to leapfrog over some of the kind of medical aging problems that China is going to face as it's with its huge population in the coming years. So yeah, I mean, a lot to say about that, but yeah, maybe I'll keep it very brief here. Yeah, 56. Ross is in the comments is correcting me. 56. Okay. Yeah.
As our Think Out quickly turns political, we are nearing the end of our Think Out. I mean, it's of course, there's so many topics that have arisen that we should really take further. I think it's really interesting to look at how nations indeed mobilize genomics. It's really interesting to look at this concept of proactive healthcare and the role of genomics there. Ian, maybe after you can catch up with Wilson Go, because there's still a question there whether there's a spurious result in your data, which is still left on the table in our Q&A. You might want to have a look at that. So we are nearing the end. That means that we'll put up the poll question again to have a look how you feel about whether genomics will lead to more or less inequality in healthcare. It'd be very interesting to see whether any opinions in the audience have changed around that. Not in the least because we bet a good bottle of wine over that topic between the 4 of us. So we're very interested to know what the outcomes will be here. And as we wait for the outcomes, I'll just start nearing the end of the discussion, that to let you know, audience, that we are near to the end of our Think Out debate. Thank you so much for engaging with us, for being present. It's not easy hanging in there in an online meeting. So we really, really appreciate you joining in this discussion. And our thanks, of course, go to Joanne Gao, who is an expert in genomics and medical oncology, and Ian McGonigal specializes in relationships between the human genome products and ethnic identity. So our Think Out water bottle, this is a huge collector's item, you may not know this, is coming your way with our thanks. Audience, thank you so much for your participation. Please follow us on our social media platforms, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, even though I think the buyers beware should also be counted here on how you deal with social media. But please follow us, find us to learn more about this debate series. And you can also access research papers and further information on both of today's speakers and the topic. So let's have a look at the poll results. Hallam, do you want to take?
Yes, I just saw it. It is almost exactly the same. So we have, I think, a slight decrease from 66% to 64%, say, increases. So
we convince one person, basically.
Yeah, or maybe that's, you know, given people come and go, maybe that's within the standard error of what we're measuring here. Nevertheless.
Well, you're saying no one wins that bottle of wine. That's kind of the conclusion here.
Yeah, no bottle of wine for anyone.
Okay. Well, thank you so much, everybody. We really look forward to you all joining our future Think Out session, which will be, of course, in the new year. Thank you very much. And thank you all.
Thank you.
Bye.